The Wind's Confession by Ruben White. The sea wind carried secrets. Jebediah Stone knew this truth as surely as he knew the weight of his Colt revolver or the ache in his bones that preceded a storm. Standing on the weathered porch of their newly acquired coastal cottage, he watched his wife Elsa hang linens on the line, her slender figure swaying like a reed in the persistent breeze. "They'll dry quick out here," she called over her shoulder, offering him a fragile smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Different from back home, ain't it? The air tastes like salt instead of dust." Jeb nodded, his calloused fingers absently stroking the worn wood of the railing. Home had been 300 miles inland, where the earth cracked under an unforgiving sun and cattle lowed in the distance. But they couldn't stay there, not after what happened. Not after Elsa's breakdown. "Reckon it'll take some getting used to," he replied, his voice gravelly from disuse. Words didn't come easy to Jeb Stone, never had. But Elsa needed them now more than ever, so he tried. "You feeling settled?" She paused, a white sheet billowing between her hands like a surrender flag. "I think so. The sound of the waves, it helps me sleep." She didn't mention the nightmares that still came, the ones that left her trembling in their bed, but Jeb heard them all the same. The town of Salt Wind sprawled below their hillside perch, a collection of weather-beaten buildings that seemed to huddle together against the relentless coastal wind. It wasn't much, a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a scatter of homes, but it was far enough from their past to give Elsa a chance at healing. Jeb had taken work at the Morgan Ranch, 2 miles north of town. Good, honest labor that left his muscles aching and his mind too tired for memories. The owner, a hard-nosed businessman named Theodore Morgan, paid fair wages and asked few questions. That suited Jeb just fine. "I'm heading to work," he said, adjusting his hat against the morning glare. "You'll be all right?" Elsa's hand stilled on the sheet. "Of course. I might walk into town later, visit the general store. Mrs. Peterson said they're getting in new fabric." Jeb hesitated. Elsa hadn't been to town alone since they'd arrived 2 weeks ago. "You sure about that?" "I can't hide forever, Jeb." Her voice carried an edge of determination he hadn't heard in months. "Besides, it's broad daylight, and Sheriff Hayes said this is the quietest town in 3 territories." He wanted to argue, to protect her from whatever dangers might lurk in the seemingly peaceful streets below. But Doc Jackson had been clear, they needed to let Elsa find her strength again, one small step at a time. "All right then," he conceded. "But you come straight home if you start feeling, if you need to." She nodded, turning back to her laundry. Jeb watched her for a moment longer before stepping off the porch. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, waited patiently by the hitching post. As he swung into the saddle, Jeb cast one last glance at his wife. The wind had picked up, whipping the sheets around her like ghostly dancers, and for a moment, she seemed to disappear among them. The day passed like any other at the Morgan Ranch, mending fences, moving cattle, the rhythm of work as familiar as breathing. But as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, an uneasy feeling settled in Jeb's gut. He'd learned long ago to trust such feelings, and Theodore Morgan didn't argue when he asked to leave early. Thunder's hooves kicked up dust along the coastal road, but Jeb barely noticed the cloud that enveloped him. His focus was fixed on the cottage ahead, where something seemed wrong. The sheet still hung on the line, now dirty from the day's wind, and the front door stood wide open. "Elsa," he called out, dismounting before Thunder had fully stopped. No answer came from the shadowy interior of their home. "Elsa!" The cottage had been ransacked. Furniture lay overturned, dishes shattered on the floor, and their few possessions scattered like leaves in a storm. Jeb's heart hammered against his ribs as he moved from room to room, gun drawn. He found her in the bedroom, huddled in a corner, her dress torn and her eyes wide with terror. "Jeb," she whispered, as if unsure he was real. "Jeb, he was here. The man with the silver watch chain." Jeb knelt beside her, holstering his weapon to gather her trembling form in his arms. "Who, Elsa? Who was here?" "Said he was selling things. Brushes and combs and. Her voice broke. I told him we didn't need anything, but he wouldn't leave. Kept saying how pretty I was, how lonely I must be up here all alone. Rage bloomed in Jeb's chest, hot and familiar. Did he hurt you? Elsa shook her head, then nodded, then shook it again. I don't. I can't remember. Everything's jumbled up. But his hands, Jeb. His hands were everywhere, and I couldn't. Sure, he soothed, even as his free hand curled into a fist. You're safe now. I'm here. Sheriff Hayes arrived within the hour, his young deputy Clem in tow. They took statements, examined the scene, and promised to send word to neighboring towns about the traveling salesman. Lot of drifters on the coast road these days, Hayes said, scratching his grey-streaked beard. But most ain't bold enough to try something like this in broad daylight. We'll find him, Jeb. You have my word. But Jeb saw the doubt in the sheriff's weathered face, heard the unspoken questions. Why hadn't anyone in town seen this mysterious salesman? How had he known Elsa would be alone? And why were there no footprints in the dusty yard except Elsa's own? The days that followed were a slow torture. Elsa jumped at every sound, refused to leave the cottage, and barely slept. When she did, her dreams were filled with silver watch chains and grasping hands. Jeb watched helplessly as the progress she'd made since arriving in Saltwind crumbled like sand castles in the tide. Doc Jackson, a kindly man with eyes that had seen too much suffering, suggested a change of scenery might help. Sometimes the mind needs distance to heal, he explained. Take her to Millbrook for a few days. It's larger than Saltwind, might help her feel less isolated. Jeb agreed, though leaving meant the trail of Elsa's attacker would grow colder. They took the stagecoach, Elsa pressed against his side, her eyes darting at every passenger who boarded along the way. Millbrook was indeed larger than Saltwind, with proper streets and a 2-story hotel. For the first day, Elsa seemed to improve, even managing a genuine smile as they walked through the bustling market square. But on their second evening, as they sat in the hotel's dining room, everything changed. It's him, Elsa whispered, her fork clattering to her plate. The salesman. He's here. Jeb followed her gaze to a well-dressed man seated alone at the bar. He wore a fine suit, and yes, a silver watch chain glinted at his vest. You're certain? Jeb asked, though he already knew the answer. The terror in Elsa's eyes was answer enough. Please, Jeb. Don't let him hurt me again. The man finished his drink and headed upstairs. Jeb waited 10 minutes, then followed, telling Elsa to lock herself in their room. The stranger was in room 204, humming tunelessly as he prepared for bed. Jeb didn't knock. The door splintered under his boot, and the man barely had time to turn before Jeb's fist connected with his jaw. Please, the stranger gasped, blood trickling from his split lip. I don't know what you want. You know exactly what you did, Jeb growled, landing another blow. To my wife. In our home. Wife? I've never. I'm just a cotton buyer from San Francisco. They struggled across the room, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. In the darkness, Jeb saw the man reach for something in his jacket. The glint of metal was all it took. His gun cleared leather faster than thought, and the report was deafening in the confined space. The stranger lay still, his unseeing eyes fixed on the ceiling. There was no weapon, only a letter opener that had fallen from his hand. The hotel erupted in chaos. Jeb grabbed Elsa from their room, and they fled into the night, taking back roads and cattle trails toward Saltwind. But Elsa's condition worsened with every mile. She saw her attacker in every shadow, every passing stranger. 3 times she identified different men as the salesman, each description widely different from the last. Sheriff Hayes caught up with them a week later, on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind howled around them like a living thing, drowning out the waves below. It's over, Jeb, Hayes called out, his voice heavy with regret. The man you killed in Millbrook? Thomas Wheeler, respected businessman, father of 3. Never been to Saltwind in his life. No, Jeb shook his head. He attacked Elsa. She recognized him. Did she? Hayes took a step closer. Like she recognized that cattle driver in Pembroke? Or the blacksmith in Red Fork? Jeb. Elsa's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the wind like a knife. I have to tell you something. He turned to her, this woman he'd loved enough to kill for, to die for. She stood at the cliff's edge, her dress whipping around her like dark wings. There was no salesman, she said, tears streaming down her face. There never was. I made him up. I needed you to see me again, to care like you did before. When you're working, it's like I don't exist. The silence in that cottage, the emptiness, it was killing me. I thought if you had someone to protect me from, you'd stay closer to home. I never meant for anyone to die. The truth hit Jeb like a physical blow, driving him to his knees in the salt-crusted grass. All the signs had been there, the lack of footprints, the inconsistent descriptions, the convenient appearances of the salesman whenever Elsa felt most alone. I killed an innocent man, he choked out. You killed for love, Elsa replied. Like you've always done. But I can't live with it anymore. The guilt is eating me alive. She took another step toward the cliff's edge. Jeb lunged for her, but Hayes was faster, pulling her to safety as she collapsed in tears. The trial was brief. Jeb's confession, coupled with testimony about Elsa's mental state, led to a sentence of 20 years. Elsa was committed to an asylum in San Francisco, where doctors promised to help her find her way back to reality. On the day they took him to the territorial prison, Jeb stood on the transport wagon and looked out over the sea. The wind still carried secrets, but now he understood their weight. Love, when twisted by fear and loneliness, could destroy as surely as any bullet. And sometimes the greatest deceptions were the ones we told ourselves. Years later, when asked about the case, Sheriff Hayes would say it wasn't really about murder at all. It was about the lies we tell to keep love alive, and the terrible price of believing them. But mostly, he'd say, it was about the wind, that relentless coastal wind that could drive a person mad with its whispers until they couldn't tell the difference between truth and shadows dancing in the dust. The cottage still stands on its windswept hill, empty now except for the ghosts of what might have been. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the tide is high, locals swear they can hear a woman's voice carried on the breeze, confessing her sins to the uncaring sea. The end. Join the adventure with the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.